My name is Mike, and I serve as one of the pastors here. I want to welcome you to our worship service. Today is Super Bowl Sunday. I don't know if I'm allowed to say Super Bowl. Is that like copyright or something? But there's a big game going on today. We don't have plans, but if someone's hosting an event, we're a small church. Let each other know. Hang out and watch the game and enjoy this high holy day in the United States of America. It's good to be with you. It's been a cold, windy week, obviously, and we might get more cold this week. So I hope you're all staying warm and checking in on each other and your neighbors. But we're going to dive in today's message. On most Sundays, we normally select the gospel passage, usually a passage from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, from the lectionary, which is this pre-selected selection of readings from the Bible over the course of 3 years. That's what we normally do in our sermon times. But for the next few weeks, we're going to be spending some time in the Old Testament book of Genesis. It's the first book of the Bible, and it is a big book, like 50 chapters, so we're not going to cover even most of it. We're just going to cover the first few chapters, and I just felt like at the beginning of the year, I mean, it's February now, but it would just be appropriate for us to spend a bit of time in this foundational book of Scripture, and a foundational book for, I think, what it means for us to be human, and what it means to be people made in the image of God. Now, before I begin, let me just acknowledge that Genesis can be tricky. This book has been, for some, the source of much debate and controversy, especially the first few chapters. For others, Genesis has been a firm foundation, and for many others, a strange mix of both, right? This comforting, foundational book, but also one that can be tricky and controversial as well. And wherever you are on that spectrum, I want to invite you to come again with fresh eyes and open hearts. My goal is not going to be to change your minds or to erase your doubts, but to open you as best as I can to the text itself. I'm going to switch to this mic because I think we're getting a little staticky here. I want to open to you as best I can the text itself and invite God's Spirit to meet us in our shared study of this word. So that's where we're going to be going today and for the next few weeks. So I invite you to journey with me. And as we do each week, we'll have some time for discussion, for question and answer as well. So as your questions arise, make sure to write them down or to text them because we'll be spending some time afterwards to field some of those questions. But let's pray before we dive in. Take a moment to pray for yourself. Ask that God would open your eyes and ears to soften your hearts to receive the word that he would have you receive today. And also take a moment to pray for me that I would be faithful in communicating this word for us today. So let's spend a few moments and just pray together. So now, God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be pleasing unto you today. For we pray this all in your name. Amen. All right. We begin today, in the beginning, with Genesis chapter 1. And Genesis 1, of course, tells the story of God creating the world. And when people read the first chapter of Genesis, the question that often gets asked is, did God really create the whole world in just 6 days? Or other questions that might arise are, well, this is cool, but where are the dinosaurs in this story? Or how does this story engage with the theory of evolution, the fossil record? How old is the Earth anyways? Who was even there to write all of this stuff down? And these are all, of course, fascinating questions, and there's many, many more questions we could ask, but we might get into trouble when we ask questions that the story itself is not trying to answer. Or another way of saying it is, and maybe this is our little motto for our series in Genesis, we need to let Genesis be Genesis on its own terms. We need to let Genesis be Genesis on its own terms. We must not try to force Genesis to answer questions that Genesis itself has no intention of answering. We mustn't impose a worldview or concepts that the original author or hearers would have no idea about. English-speaking North Americans living in the 21st century, and that's us, see and explain the world very differently from ancient Hebrews living thousands of years ago. Genesis 1 is not a science textbook. It is not a history textbook. Genesis 1 is a poem about God and creation. And you might be thinking, wait, Pastor Mike, it's a poem? So that means it's not true then. It's just made up? And that is not what I said. Genesis 1 is a poem that tells of God and his creation. And see, we react to that because in the modern world, it's easy to forget that there are ways of telling the truth other than just formulas or Western-style history. We're taught through many years of going to school and college, university, and grad school that if you can't prove it or measure it, touch it, feel it, taste it, then it's not real, it's not true. But that kind of thinking completely ignores the fact that though numbers and data, facts and figures are important ways of describing the world and have led to all kinds of amazing inventions and breakthroughs, they are not the only way of describing the world. And in fact, the deepest things often require language that goes beyond mere numbers and data, facts and figures. But language can be tricky, right? Here's a really common example. In the English language, I can say, the sun rises in the east, and everyone will nod their heads. Yes, the sun rises in the east. It is a scientific fact. It has always risen in the east and set in the west. I have no idea where east and west are, but it rises in the east and it sets in the west every day for as long as we know. The thing is, the sun doesn't actually rise. For us, standing on the earth, it looks like it's rising from the horizon, but what's actually happening is the earth is rotating on its axis, giving the appearance of the sun rising. The sun stays put relative to the earth. Is my science correct there? I don't know. Yeah, okay, good, all right. Now, we don't say that all the time. That's not the way language works. I don't stay up all night with my wife to watch a beautiful sunrise and say, honey, wasn't that a beautiful rotation of the earth while in orbit around the sun? Same with a photograph of my family. If I pulled out a picture of my family and said, this is my family, here's my wife and my kids, I don't have to say, this is a printout of a digital image of my family. My actual family is at home. I don't need to explain that to you because that's not how language works. I can say, this is my family, and everyone says, cool. Every language and culture has its own unique way of expressing truth. Just try learning a second language or visiting a foreign country, and you'll very quickly figure that out. That's why I think it's a good habit to remember that when reading the Bible, even though we have English language versions of the Bible, that every time we read this book, we should treat it like we're visiting a foreign country. Just as it's a mistake to go to a foreign country and insist that they do things the way that we do back home, it's a mistake to read Genesis or anything in the Bible and insist that it tell its story the way that we would in 21st century English-speaking North America. Does that make sense? A little prelude here before we dive in. Okay, obviously we'll have more time to chat about stuff like that during the discussion, but for now, let's dive in and do our best to try to let Genesis be Genesis on its own terms. Now, if you want, you're welcome to look up Genesis chapter 1 in your Bibles, if you brought them, or on your phone, that's fine. You'll see there's Bibles in front of you, but they're actually just the New Testament, so you can't read Genesis in those versions. I'm going to explain why those Bibles are in those seat pockets in a few weeks, but for now, you're welcome to pull up Genesis 1 on your phones, but I'll also have it on the screen. So sad I have to tell you that we have to look it up on our phones. So anyways, I won't be offended if you're looking at your phones during this message. It's okay. All right, Genesis 1, I believe the key to understanding this text lies in verses 1 and 2. Now, this is going to be tiny, and there's a reason why. I don't expect you to be able to read it. I'll read it out loud. I'll explain in a moment why it's so tiny. Very tiny. Okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now, we're going to get to the story of creation here, and when we read it, normally, we read it as a chronological sequence of events, right? First this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Even the way that's kind of laid out, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, right? First this happens, then that, then this, then that. But if we just read it sequentially like that, we might miss the point that's being made through the structure of how these events are laid out. And this is why I put the text so small on the screen, so you can see the larger structure of Genesis 1. All the individual words matter, but the structure is critical for how we understand this. All right, so let me highlight some of the key lines in each of the days of creation here. All right, so day 1 separated the light from the darkness. Day 2, God separated the water, that is the vault from the under, the water above it. Day 3, the dry ground separated from the gathered waters. Day 4, the lights in the vault of the sky. Day 5, so there's these key events that happen in each day. All right. Now, this is something that's hard to do in our own Bibles, because when we read the Bible, because it's printed as a book, we tend to read from top to bottom, left to right. That's how we read books in the English language, right? Top to bottom, left to right. But the Bible was not originally written as a book. It was transmitted orally, right? From our mouths, from mom to kid, from one generation to another. It was passed on orally. And when you hear this story orally, you would have picked up on the pattern instantly. But it's harder to see when it's written down in a book form. And so the pattern that emerges that you would have heard orally would look something like this. And the reason why I arranged it like that is because we see that days 1, 2, and 3, where God forms the creation, right, separating light from dark, waters above from water below, and the dry land from the water, we see that those first 3 days of forming correspond with days 4, 5, and 6, right? So day 4, God fills what was formed on day 1. On day 5, God is filling what was formed on day 2. And on day 6, God fills what was formed on day 3. And if you look at the key highlighted verses there, you'll see that kind of makes sense, right? Day 1, light from dark. Day 4, he fills with the sun, the moon, and the stars. Day 2, the waters above and the water below are filled with the fish of the seas and the birds of the skies. And day 3, where God separates the dry land from the seas, God fills on day 6 with the animals. And so if we could summarize it, days 1, 2, and 3 is God forming. Days 4, 5, and 6, God is filling. And this poem then is not so much about how creation took place as it is a poem about who created it and why. To force this text to answer questions about evolution and the age of the earth is to force this text to answer questions it isn't asking. A better starting point is, what does the author of Genesis want us to understand? And the point of Genesis 1 isn't how creation happened or how long it took. If that's not the point, what is the point? Well, there are lots of points. But for today, let me draw your attention to this main point. And it has to do with how days 1, 2, and 3, and 4, 5, and 6, the forming and filling, answer the question in verse 2. When the earth was formless and empty, God formed it and filled it. Do you see how that works? The thesis is in verse 2. The earth was formless and empty, and God entered into that formless, empty creation and formed it and filled it. And this is what I offer to you, that the God who formed and filled creation at the very beginning is always forming and filling. The God who formed and filled creation at the very beginning is always forming and filling. And this might be really good news for a lot of us. But the reality is, not all of us believe this. Effectively, many of us believe that in the beginning, God created a bunch of rules, a bunch of laws, principles. And then God created people to keep those rules, right? And it sounds absurd, but many of us operate with that fundamental understanding. In the beginning, God created laws and rules, and then he created people to keep those rules. God created a perfect world, absolutely perfect. But then people screwed it up because they couldn't help but to break the rules. They kept messing with God's perfect creation. And ever since, we've been dealing with the consequences of those actions. Many of us hold to that as our fundamental belief about how the world works. Now, to illustrate this, I want to show you a quick clip from the 2014 movie, The Lego Movie. Now, this is near the end of the movie, so I hope I'm not spoiling things for you, but it's like 12 years old, okay? So statute of limitations. So let me illustrate here how effectively we actually view our relationship with God and creation.
The man upstairs. What happened? No, this is a disaster. Why, what? Why is the dragon on top of the luxury condo development?
I was just playing and...
Look, I know it's hard to understand, but this is dad stuff, okay? All of this that you see before you is all your father's. And everything is thought out. What did you do down here? Did you take the top off of the tower?
It was an accident.
You accidentally, expertly, carefully took the entire top off of that tower?
Yes.
You know the rules. This isn't a toy.
It kind of is.
No, actually, it's a highly sophisticated interlocking brick system.
But we bought it at the toy store.
We did, but the way I'm using it makes it an adult thing.
The box for this one said ages 8 to 14.
That's a suggestion. They have to put that on there.
You can't expect me to be able to resist playing with all this.
Look, now you have your stuff over near the Christmas decorations. All those bricks, you can build anything you want. Finn, we're gonna play a little game. It's called Let's Put Everything Back the Way You Found It.
But Dad, you don't understand.
So I can make things the way they're supposed to be. Permanently.
Okay. Now, it might seem silly, right, this movie, but it's actually pretty profound. And I wonder how many dads here are feeling a little bit guilty about the way we've treated our kids' toys. But I wonder, like I said, how many of us actually, in practice, hold to this view of God and creation? I love in the movie how they even said that when they heard the footsteps, the man upstairs, right? That's kind of how we think about God and creation. The man upstairs coming down to scold us for messing with his perfect creation. But Genesis 1 doesn't begin with a God who created a bunch of rules and a perfect creation that is exactly the way it should be, if not for those pesky, sinful humans. Genesis 1 begins with chaos and uncertainty, a formless and empty earth that God chooses to form and fill into goodness and beauty and love. God isn't endlessly frustrated with us because we keep messing up his perfect creation. God is endlessly committed to meeting us in the mess that we've made and inviting us to join him in the work of repair and restoration, reconciliation, and redemption. The good news of the gospel is that God enters into our mess, into the chaos of our lives, and offers to form us. And this is what happens when we come to this little church building, and we sing our songs, and we pray our prayers, and we listen to these stories from the scriptures. We are being formed. When we trust God, when we follow the way of Jesus, we're not just doing stuff for God, we are being formed into the people God is calling us to be. Now, there are some kids here, kids under the age of 18, and you guys, you're going to learn about the world and God and faith and math and science and music and art and friendship and beauty and all that kind of stuff. And God is right there with you, gently forming you as you learn and grow. And as adults, we get to watch this happen in the lives of the kids around us. But grown-ups, that process doesn't end just because we graduate from high school or get a college degree or get married or whatever life event happens to us. To be a disciple of Jesus is to be a lifelong learner of the way of Jesus, to be shaped and formed in his way for our entire lives. Christian formation doesn't just happen when we're young. It's a lifelong process. God forms us continuously, constantly through the course of our lives. But he also fills us right? The Christian story tells us that through God's Spirit, we are filled with God's very presence and power. And filled for what purpose? To participate in the work of restoration, redemption, and reconciliation. We can't possibly do this work without the filling of God's Spirit. The God who formed and filled at the very beginning of creation is always forming and filling us. So a pastoral word for all of us. Friends, do not be discouraged by the madness and the chaos swirling around us. That is not the evidence of God's absence. The chaos and the madness is always the starting point for God to do his redemptive work in and through us. For God is always forming and filling. But we need eyes to see where he is at work, and more importantly, the courage to join in when invited. I know the news can be overwhelming at times. What do we believe? What do we even do? Where do we even start? And I feel like this text from Genesis encourages us, because as God looked at a formless void, right, the chaos in the beginning, God did not throw up his hands and say, I don't even know. God rolled up his sleeves and got to work, forming and filling, and he continues to do that work even today. So I encourage you, don't turn your eyes away from the madness and the chaos of the world, but rather look upon the world as God does, through a redemptive lens, and ask, how, Lord, are you forming and filling me that I might participate in the redemptive work that you're doing in me, but also through me? So I want to pause there and give us a chance to respond, to ask questions. I'm sure there are questions about Genesis, and we could tackle some of those as well, but we can also wrestle with, what would that look like for us to actually believe that God forms and fills, even in the midst of the chaos and the madness swirling around us? So I'm going to pass around the mic, and then we have a chance to respond to some questions. Oh, the text number's not up there. That's okay. You can just text me personally if you want. But let's spend a few moments in response. Jeff, if you wouldn't mind being the mic runner. Thank you, sir. A few moments, just whatever questions come to mind about the text, about forming and filling, and then after a few moments of discussion, as we do each week, we'll come to the table. So, questions, thoughts, responses to Genesis 1, to what we're talking about today. Miriam, yeah.
So I've been kind of mulling over Genesis 1 almost the past season, so it's been really fun. I really love that it's a process, that it doesn't happen in one day, that there's opposites involved. It's very, I'm going to say creative but engineering all at the same time. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
But did God have a big picture when he started? Did he have a plan, or did he just start with day one and then kind of think, all right, I got inspired, now I got another idea? Is it an inspirational process, or is there a grand vision that he's putting puzzle pieces into place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think the text has a clear answer to that, Miriam. But it seems like the story that we're given, you can almost argue that it's like, God, are you just making stuff up as you go along? Because we have this whole winding kind of crazy story. But then what's the alternative? That God does have this exact plan and he's just executing it? Because the one problem with that idea is that what is the role of human beings, right? If God has this perfect plan and perfect engineered, like the blueprint, and then there's these people, what is the role of human agency? What do we bring to the table if God already has it all planned out? And so that is a conundrum. I don't think we have an easy answer for that. I would love to hear other thoughts, but it seems like God does have a general desire for creation, that it would be good and beautiful and creative and just. And he grants human beings agency, which means that we get to participate, we get to contribute, we get to be in some ways co- or sub-creators with God, but we can also mess it up. And that seems to be the choice that God has made. I'm going to allow these people to also contribute to this, but that means that it's going to get messy. So that would be my first contribution. If other people have thoughts about that as well, I'd love to hear it. Or even Marion, if you want to respond to it, if you have your own hypothesis about God's grand design versus how it actually plays out. Or we can just skip to the next question. I would argue that I think it is a little bit of that God does have a will, but it isn't specifically laid out. I think God does, and this is a crazy thought. I don't know where I heard this phrase, but God grants us, human beings, the dignity of causality. I don't know if you've heard that phrase, the dignity of causality. In other words, he allows us to participate. That our prayers can actually move God. Wait, Dan, Miriam, and then,
I mean, I kind of feel like the reason there's a pause in the days, like it's not that God is tired and he needs a break.
Correct.
But I think he is kind of thinking through it, and that there is, I like to say, a form of inspiration and taking a break and thinking about what that next step might look like.
Yeah. I'm actually, and we can pass the mic to Dan, actually reading a book right now called Slow Theology. And one of the first chapters says, why did God take 6 days when he could have done it instantly? And I think there is something to that. There's something about the slowness and the process that's just as important as what is created. And maybe that's a cue that we should also take. Yeah, Dan.
I guess I've come to sort of view it as it can be both things at the same time. Mm-hmm. And maybe at first glance that doesn't seem possible, so let me try to explain it. I had somebody give me an analogy once, not a pastor that I really liked. And it was called the mosaic. This notion that like we're all tile pieces. So it's not quite like a puzzle, right? And we have agency and free will, and we interact with those around us, and it changes the color and our shapes. But we're a part of the mosaic, so our ability to see the whole thing is pretty limited. And if you were standing right in front of the mosaic, what you would see doesn't look quite the same if you step way, way, way back, which is sort of more like God's vantage point.
Yeah.
And I guess I've sort of viewed it as, I think God has a desired end state for all things, but to your point, I think free will is real. And I think there are times where he nudges us in ways that he might not otherwise, and so that might tip the scales for us, but that by and large, to your point, like he grants us the dignity of causality. I think that's important, right? Because we pray and then sometimes like a conversation occurs afterwards. And I can't help but think to myself, God heard my prayer, and then he nudged someone to come into my life who might not otherwise have had that thought. I mean, like I know people, and I certainly have had the thought, like, I just need to ask that person like more than once how they're doing today, right? But not all the time. Why this one time does that happen? So I guess that's me trying to say that both things can be true at once.
And I think that's tricky for us because we are very much products of a mechanical worldview, right? For the last few hundred years, we've lived in a world where we can kind of know if we do X, Y, Z that this will result in whatever, and so we kind of assume that's how the world works. And it does. We can do a lot of stuff. We can really, with a good measure of predictability, make things happen. But we have lost a sense of the thing that you're kind of alluding to here. There's kind of mysterious. I'm hesitant to use this word because when I say it, it's going to sound like Harry Potter. But we've lost this kind of magical or enchanted worldview. And even Harry Potter type stuff is kind of like we can make things happen, just like I can clean this room by just saying a spell. That's still just kind of a different version of the mechanical worldview, like AI. I just ask it and it kind of gives you this almost magical answer. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an enchanted worldview where these two things can't exist. Where God can have a plan and a grand idea, we can have agency and participate in it, but we don't know exactly how it's all working because we're limited in our perspective, in our view. So I think the challenge for us is to kind of, how do we still operate and live in the world that we know and understand, but also appreciate when we time travel or even voyage to this foreign country, also appreciate this is not how we've always understood the world. And there are other ways of trying to understand how God and the world kind of operate together. So, and we have to slow down for that to happen. We have to have conversations like these. We have to slow down, read Scripture. Even if Genesis 1 you've read 1,000 times, read it 1,001 times, because there is still more there that will challenge us and encourage us. So thank you. I mean, that's a great, Christine. Let's keep it going. I think we're starting to get warmed up here.
Totally different question, but I like this formed and filled idea. I think you've talked about this before, and I probably asked a similar question last time. But my sense is that mainstream Christianity is really digging in its heels on this is the true story of God. This is true. Don't question it. When I was younger, I feel like evolution was a little bit more shaky on its standing, and people would always push back on, the Christian community where I grew up would always be oh, evolution, it's garbage, And I feel like we've come a lot further from that and been oh, actually, there's a lot of evidence that that's probably true. And so I guess I'm wondering, the formed and filled thing I really like. I also feel like we're sidestepping a major issue, which is kind of nice. But also, what do you do? I feel like there are some Christians who are really frustrated even by calling the Bible a story or a narrative, because it sounds like it's just a story instead of, this happened and then this happened. It just, so I guess, what do you, how do you describe this to your kids?
Yeah.
How do you, without it sounding like it's not true, how do you deal with that true question? Especially when we talk with other Christians who might have a really black and white, breakable view of all of this, like our parents and others. How do you deal with that?
Whew.
An impossible question.
Yeah, it's impossible because every situation is a little bit different. And you're right, context is so important, because some people grew up in a context where there just were these assumptions about the Bible or about truth or about worldview, and you just got to kind of start where you are. But for me, I know the breakthrough wasn't, I read this book by some liberal scholar and he convinced me that this, it wasn't that. Literally, it was just studying the Bible itself. I think that's a really good place to start. So why I went out of my way to show this is it's kind of in their text itself. I'm not saying, there's a different version of the Bible that says, this about evolution. It's just in the text itself. Verse 2, the earth was formless and empty. And when you read through the text, it seems like it's saying, and therefore God formed and filled that which was formless and empty. That feels poetic, right? Because I remember when I was doing campus ministry, I was doing this Bible study in Genesis with a bunch of students, and one student was in engineering physics or something, really hard science, right? And he was with these peers who were just hardcore atheists. The Bible was a joke to them. They just saw the world in a very scientific way, right? Can't prove it, then it's not true. And he was just going backwards because he had faith. He really wanted to believe. And we struggle with that, but if we just look at the text itself and just take it on its own terms, I don't really see a conflict, because it seems to be pretty clear that the Bible is not saying, even if you say, here was the conflict for him. Hey, Mike, on day 1, God basically creates light, right? He created light from darkness. But then on day 4, he creates the sun, the moon, the stars. How does that work? How do you get light before the source of light? And then he was like, maybe if you're looking at it from this vantage point, and it's primordial times, and the atmosphere of the earth was kind of cloudy, and so it kind of looked like the sun, the moon, the stars, but then after a few thousand years, it became, I'm like, I think you're trying too hard to make it fit into a scientific worldview. When we just take it on its own terms, it's not saying this is the exact sequence in which the earth was created. This is an answer to the question of what did God do with a formless and empty creation? He formed it, and he filled it in a way that would have made sense in an oral culture, right? And I think that's what we miss sometimes when we read it as a book, is that this was stuff that was spoken out loud, that was written down. And so I would just start there and just say, what does the Bible itself just say? And then we can, because if we just introduce things like what is true, evolution, it just completely sidetracks us. So I would just say, for people who take the Bible seriously, just study the Bible. and then let it speak on its own terms. I think a lot of times it kind of emerges. That's my kind of starting point, but if other people have experiences of engaging with people that this became contentious and you found a way to navigate through it, I'd love to hear those stories too. But yeah, Rob, do you have a story? Or tell a story, Rob. Tell a story.
I'm a physicist initially, and so one of my colleagues said, there's two creation stories, and they're different. So the whole thing is nonsense.
Yeah.
And I feel like answering that by saying, if you think there are only two creation stories in the Bible, you don't know your Bible. I don't say that.
Okay.
But I'm really passionate about this because this year I'm studying the creation stories. Okay, so far I've studied, there's the two that in Genesis 1 and 2, and then after the flood was another creation story. I think we might have talked about this before. And then there's, there's Job. There's a Psalm. There's John chapter 1.
Yeah.
There's in Revelation. And there are creation stories throughout the Bible.
100%. Exodus.
In some form. And so, and then another colleague, art history professor, said, look at those cave paintings. They're I don't know how far back they go. And my response is, if there's cave paintings, those are human beings. In my view, that's a human being that had to do that. So, you just can't, I don't know that, the idea of the Earth being 5,000 years old or something is something that was made up much later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Even a lot of these debates that we assume have always been like throughout the course of history are pretty relatively recent. In American history anyways. Like there was the famous Scopes monkey trial, if you know about that, where it came to a public kind of, front, this debate. And that's because there was a thing going on in America, the rise of, there are political reasons, there's historical reasons, there's scientific reasons, but it wasn't always the case. It's a very recent kind of argument, very recent debate. But we shouldn't assume that that's always been the case, right? So.
Then the other, I'm also studying Aborigine creation stories. They're quite interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to say, those are the same. But I think what all of us, creation stories tell us who God is and they tell us who we are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we want the story to be like, this is what happened. This is the video evidence of how creation took place, when the story itself is telling us something about us and about God and about our purpose and our relationship with God. Right? That's what I think this story is trying to tell us, but we're insisting that it tell us something else. And that's where I think the wires get crossed. And it's interesting, even, my kids, if you remember, if you have kids, they study like Egyptian history, they learn about like Mesopotamia and Babylonian history. They learn some of these things. They're like, Dad, that's weird. Like there's a lot of similar things going on here. Ellie was studying about ancient Egypt and about the sun god and about all these things. I'm like, there's some interesting, and because again, the Bible wasn't written in a vacuum, right? A lot of these stories came to be in the context of all these different cultures telling these stories. And the Bible this is going to sound controversial. You can mute me or cancel me or whatever. But this story is in conversation with other creation stories. And it's saying something different. Those other creation stories are saying something pretty specific about the gods or about creation or about the purpose of humanity. And this story is saying something radically different in response to those creation stories. That's another important aspect of it. But when we have a tradition that just says, this book just magically just kind of came down to us exactly as is, and we just need to take it and just there's some value to that. But I think when we realize that this story was written as a part of a conversation in dialogue with these other cultures, something even more powerful emerges. Because guess what? We're always in dialogue with other worldviews and other cultures. And that's why I go back to this idea that what we can offer to the world is we believe that the God who formed and filled creation is always forming and filling. And that's how we can maybe navigate the craziness of the world around us. Maybe that's the contribution that Genesis 1 can make to our conversation, not just, we're right, evolution's wrong. It's like, is that a helpful contribution to the world? Or is something like this a little bit more helpful? Like, oh, we are inheritors of this amazing story. Yeah, Christy, and then, Becky and
He's
then
handed
Christy.
it to me because I always seem to follow on from him. But what I was thinking about was story, and maybe we need to concentrate, Christine, more on what stories are,
Yeah.
because no story tells everything.
Yeah,
You pick and choose to illustrate what you're trying to get across, whether it's fiction, whether it's nonfiction, whether it's a textbook. Our astronomy textbooks are stories about how the world might have come to be based on physical evidence, but that doesn't tell you anything beyond that. So there's so much missing in most stories, as well as what's there on the surface, that I think everything, in a sense, is a story, no
100%.
matter how you put it. So.
but we have denigrated the value of story in our modern culture. Stories are for kids, stories are entertainment, stories are fiction, and what's real is hard science, engineering, physics, chemistry, and in separating those two things, we've lost something very powerful. Yeah, Christy.
So I kind of going back to what Christine was asking about, though, like with teaching this to our kids, this is, you can't just be like, study the Bible. I've studied Genesis multiple times in multiple settings, and this is new and different. And it's kind of where I've wanted to land before, but I've certainly been in church settings where it's like, absolutely not. This is 7 24-hour days, but also with kids, like they go to Sunday school classes and they're like, on day 1 this, on day 2 this, on day 2 this. I mean, and so like, rather than being like, well, not like, how do you present that to your kids in a way that is palatable to like a 6-year-old, rather than like, all of this is more, this is all more complex and deep, and not something that a kindergartner is going to understand. But let's say that you wanted to explain this to your kids, like, how would you go about that?
Yeah, I'd be like, Sammy, sit down. Let me show you this PowerPoint presentation. And he'd be like, oh, cool, and he'd get out his notebook. You raise a great question, Christy, and we see this in churches because we do see the importance of educating the next generation, right? And so we read stories like this, and then there's animals, and so we can like bust out the flannel graph, or we can get the pictures, and it's fun, and day 1, day 2. There's something very accessible about that. And then we can skip to, Adam naming the animals, that's fun. And then the Cain and Abel thing is kind of awkward, because, but we could talk about having conflict with your siblings. And then we could skip to Noah, and then, again, animals, it's fun. But then we skip the part about, all the people who died in the flood, and Noah getting drunk afterwards and cursing an entire generation. So we kind of skip around because we're like, we want to protect our kids from all these violent things. But in doing so, we create a very patchwork kind of faith for our kids. And then one day they read the whole Bible and you're like, what have you been keeping from me, right? They're like shocked that this Bible is so R-rated, and then we presented them with a very G-rated version of it. So I don't know. We probably already screwed up with our own kids. It's hard. I mean, there's children's Bibles that are very geared toward kids but kind of miss stuff. I wonder if part of it is there's an inevitability that kids are going to misunderstand it. They just are, right? Even as us ourselves, we're going to misunderstand it. And so I go back to, I know it feels like a cop-out. The God who formed and filled creation is always forming and filling. I think I kind of take a little bit of solace in that the God who, because for me, I grew up with a very literal version of the story myself, absolutely. And I went to college and I studied science. I was in biology class, I was in physics, and I had professors who were very antagonistic toward the Christian worldview. And I was scandalized. I'm like, what do I do with this, right? Do I choose this, the way of science, or do I go the way of the church, which feels like faithful? And I had to navigate that. And luckily, I found ways to do that in a productive and creative way, I think. But I think all we can do is walk with our kids. We can't just throw the Bible at them and say, study the Bible. But a story like this, though, I think does lend itself to kids. Because we can look and read together, hey, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And we can invite kids to imagine that. Like, what do you think that was like? There's like these waters, and it's kind of scary, and it's dark. And then God said, let there be light. And it kind of invites us in there, right? But then we can ask them to like look a little bit closer and ask questions. And I think kids are really smart. I think they can see, they can ask questions. We can kind of help guide them a little bit. And I think there's actually something beautiful to be gleaned from this. But even if they don't get it right away, I think it's okay, because as parents, we have to figure out when's the appropriate time to maybe take them to that next level. And everyone's different. It's not always at the same age. I think we have to walk with them. And again, if we really do believe this, then that also applies to us. As parents, our primary responsibility is to help our kids in their formation as followers of Jesus. And that's going to look a little different for each kid. Their experience can be a little bit different. But it's not like, here's the curriculum, and then good luck. Just like God didn't say in the beginning, here are the rules, follow them. God walked with them through the entire thing with all the twists and turns. I think similarly, we have to commit to walking with our kids, with our friends and neighbors, and not just say, here's the tract, here's the 4 spiritual laws, and just that's simple, that's easy. But I think the real invitation is to engage, to walk with, to invite questions, and even to say things like, I don't know. Hopefully, as your pastor, I've modeled a little bit of that. Like, Miriam's question really threw me for a loop in the beginning. I'm like, that's not how I want to start. It's so complicated. But yeah, as opposed to many of us have grown up in traditions where this is the truth. You got to learn it or you're unfaithful. Yeah, Christine, that was a very long-winded way of trying to answer that. Maybe we need to create our own curriculum. I don't know.
Christy, thanks for coming back to my kids' question, because I do think you go different places and you're handed all this curriculum and they come home with worksheets and you're like, oh, okay, all right. But I just had a thought while you guys were talking. I read, in the last 6 months, I read C.S. Lewis's Problem of Pain. And it seemed like weird that this was in that book, but he had this whole section in the middle where he was like, I'm just making this up. I don't know if this really happened, but this is what I think happened in the beginning of time. And he had this whole story that he kind of wrote up in the middle of this book about how maybe God kind of created this archetypal person that was kind of like the caveman, and if we saw those people now, we'd be like, whoa, we've come a really long way. And his whole story assumed that evolution was correct and that it all kind of happened over time. And I was like, this is from the 1940s or something, right? I mean, I don't know when he was writing books, but yeah. But it was a long time ago, and C.S. Lewis is British, and it was a nice step out of what I feel like has been the conversation for the American church in the last 50 or 70 or 80 years or whatever about is it true, is it not, in this dichotomy we've created. So I don't know, I was just thinking, there's space for being creative and thinking it through, and even encouraging our kids well, what do you think this could have happened? Because the truth is none of us really know the exact details, right? But it was interesting reading a C.S. Lewis creative idea of how all of this panned out, and it was very much baked into the middle of evolution and how things have changed over time. It was just an interesting adding of some details that we obviously don't know, possible way that it panned out. And I was thinking there's millions of those possibilities, right, if we think about it. And I like what Rob was saying about all the different creation stories, even in John, in the beginning was the light, and and just it's different, right? It's also poetic. I don't know. So maybe with kids, it's hard to face all those curriculum worksheets that they bring home from places, and we have a handful. We have a stack of Bibles now that are children's Bibles, and they all present things very black and white, and this is what happened. Partially because kids are so concrete, but it's just It brings up a lot of questions, and I don't know, Mike, maybe the answer is just, we don't really know. What do you think? And pulling for more thoughts.
That is a part of it. I would just encourage us all. I think some of us grew up with this idea that faith requires certainty. And I think that has been really unhelpful for the church. Certainty, I don't think, is very helpful in the life of faith. Confidence, good, right? Courage, conviction, yes. But certainty, I think, is a really dangerous thing to mix with faith. And I would also say things that emerged out of a place of fear. So children's Bibles, sermons, Bible studies that are assuming that these things over there are dangerous. Evolution, modern philosophies, comparative literature, all these things. That's dangerous. And that's so much of the 19th and 20th century in America. the church was reacting to all this stuff that was emerging in universities and the liberal church, and they created this whole other world that was like kind of a posture of being afraid of that stuff and defending ourselves from that. And that's where even the term fundamentalism came from, right? These are the fundamentals, and we're basically separating ourselves from these liberals over there. And then we created this whole thing that we just call now Christianity. And it's like, your Christianity was a reaction to this emerging danger. And I would just encourage us all, don't posture yourselves around certainty or fear. That would be my encouragement to you. Stories are okay. Questions are okay. Certainty and fear, I think, are problematic and challenging. Ryan, did you want to add to that? Oh, now provoke people. It's good. We're running long, but.
I've been wrestling with stuff like this also for a couple years. One of the things that sticks out to me is that Jesus says, anyone who will not receive the kingdom like a little child surely will not enter it.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually helpful with some of the stuff you were saying about taking the stories on their own terms, because that's what kids do. And I've thought a lot about, I was very frustrated at first with our kids, like how do we, I've got like even close family members like telling stories to my kids in ways that I don't want them to. And I'm like, am I going to step in every time we visit family or, you know, but I think that really just receiving the stories on their terms, like a child would, actually helps. And I think it's not just with Genesis. I found these issues in like a lot of the core places in the Bible, like how Jesus was the Messiah. One big thing that worried me for a long time was like the people who were most like religious expected the Messiah to look a certain way, and then Jesus came and they just didn't recognize him as the Messiah. And like this isn't a new thing that we just do now. Like we have these views about like what Genesis is supposed to mean and like what these stories are supposed to mean. And in getting too much into the weeds, I think it's like, it made me wonder, like, if Jesus came, would it go over my head too? You know, because it's like, he's supposed to be powerful. That doesn't look like power. Like, he's supposed to be a king. That doesn't look like a king. But I think the people who were most childlike are the ones who were able, I don't think anybody fully understood, you know, with total clarity, but the people closest to him were the ones that were just like willing to listen, willing to ask questions, willing to like follow, just like kids are in a lot of ways. So I think that that's helped me a lot. I do think there's like a false dichotomy that we draw of like, is this true or is it just a story? Stories are true also, I think, is something I found just in different ways than like formulas. We've, I think, kind of reduced things to like a materialist worldview, and materials are the ultimate thing. I think there's an invitation to, you know, step back and take a deep breath and try and listen more.
That's really good. Eugene Peterson has a great, we could pass the mic to Katie. He has a great phrase. He talks about that minimizing adjective, just, right? When we say it's just a story, we're off. We have to just normalize saying it's a story, right? And that doesn't mean it's less true or less good, but when we say just story, that's what happens. Yeah, do you want to have the last word?
I think that's a good note to end on.
All right, kids, so we're going to go through Genesis 1 here. I'm just kidding. We're going to respond with our hymn. And it's so funny because we're going to sing This Is My Father's World, and I was thinking about that Lego movie clip. And he's like, everything here belongs to your father. Maybe I've overcomplicated things, but as we hear these words, and even as we read these scriptures, the words may be familiar to us, but our approach makes all the difference. So may we approach these familiar words, even as we approach the table and approach the scriptures and approach the people around us and our neighbors and the news, may we approach with a posture of faith, of trust, and of wonder, rather than certainty and fear.